If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Whiplash so that we can study how the middle of a story works. This 2014 film was written and directed by Damien Chazelle. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd really love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll down to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, what do you have this week for the genre?
Well, I have been looking forward to today's episode. I have to say, Whiplash is one of my all-time favorite films, and it's one of those stories that we can tackle from any angle and it will hold up. Structurally, this is an awesome movie. The writing here, I don't know how to describe it other than saying it's superlative. If you haven't already seen the film, definitely put it on your watch list. Alrighty, so the genre. What do we have? The global genre is a performance story in the arts subcategory. And the secondary genre, now according to the story grid method, I think this would be a morality testing story because in the end, Andrew self-transcends. However, there are arguments to be made for this being a status story or a worldview maturation story as well. I didn't dive really deeply into the secondary genre because it wasn't my focus for this week. And when it comes to genre, I think what matters here is that you as the writer, the creator of the story, are really clear about what it is you're trying to write. What the reader, or in this case, the viewer, takes away from it then is up to them. They'll bring their own knowledge and experience and perspective to it, and they'll receive the story through their own lens, and it may or may not line up with your original idea, and that's perfectly okay. And when it comes to nailing down which story grid genre it is, because I know that's of great concern to so many people I've met through story grid, well, to be honest, Sean is in the process of redefining his approach to genre. So, you know what? For the purposes of this episode, I don't think we need to spend too much energy trying to pigeonhole Whiplash or precisely define Andrew's arc. However, that said, when we're writing our own works in progress, I recommend that we get really clear about what it is we're creating. And this is where having masterworks becomes really useful. And by masterworks, I mean other stories that have characters with the same kind of arc as the character that you're writing. Now, what I find particularly interesting about Whiplash is that although it's a performance story, it has psychological elements. That is, there's a very clear arc that has to do with Andrew's mental health. And you don't often see that in a performance story, although Black Swan is another example. These psychological elements, I don't know what else to call them, I'm just calling them psychological elements, might also be called thriller elements, depending who you're talking to and how they interpret thriller. There's a difference between a thriller and a story that's thrilling, but most people don't understand that. And so any story that's thrilling is, for marketing purposes, often called a thriller. Whiplash is not a thriller, but it's not your run-of-the-mill performance story either. Now, I could spend the whole hour, Melanie, talking about just the genre here, but I'll move on because we've got a lot of things to talk about. But what did you have for the genre of Whiplash?
Well, I had for the global genre performance as well, and then I chose status for the secondary genre. But I will say that this was difficult for me this week because by studying context, I'm actually studying what the story is about and the message that it sends, whether it's deliberate or not deliberate. So I thought that even though I was doing the genres, and I suppose in some ways they're obvious, but I thought Well, Whiplash isn't about either of those things. So to me, it's about power and abuse. And the subtext of the movie, I think, asks the question, is it okay to abuse a person physically and emotionally under the guise of achieving greatness? And is it good for the person being abused to accept the abuse if it's spun as a pathway to greatness? So these were all the things that were rushing around in my head, just even trying to work out what the genre was and how I was going to approach the analysis this week. So, this is good because that's why I'm studying subtext, because it is one thing to have a framework, which is what we talk about, right, when we're talking about genres. And there's another thing about the messages or the signaling that you're delivering as you're writing the story. So I found that fascinating, and it even took me a long time to work out the genre, just because I had a few things going around my head this week. But I know how much you love this story, so I'm actually really looking forward to hearing how you approached it from a middles perspective.
This season, I am looking at the middles of stories. Last season, I looked at the first act and the last act. So naturally, I'm looking at that middle act this season. And it's a hefty chunk of storytelling. It's at least half of your story. The beginning sets up your story. The end pays off what you set up in the beginning. And the middle is where all this juicy storytelling takes place. It's the conflict, the tension, the stakes, the character development. It's all that. Now, in order to really nail this part of your story, you must understand and decide what the structural form of your story is going to be. So you need to ask yourself questions like, how many protagonists does my story have? Is my story linear? Am I using a framing story? And if so, why? Am I using flashbacks? And if so, why? How many plot lines does my story have? How many points of view does my story have? The answers to these questions will help you determine whether you're writing an arc plot story, which is also called a classical story structure, a multi-plot story, a mini-plot story, or an anti-plot story. Now, I've said it before, I'll say it again. My best advice for beginning writers is to learn how to tell a linear single protagonist story first. In other words, master the arc plot story structure. I mean, sure, you can jump right into a multi-protagonist, multi-plot, non-linear story if you want to. It is your book. You can do what you want with it. But do it with the knowledge and understanding that you're making the task much more difficult for yourself. You're increasing the degree of difficulty enormously, and you may be setting yourself up for failure, and I wouldn't want that. There's a real reason why most people don't finish their novels. And there's a reason why most of the books on Amazon, all 48.5 million of them right now, most of them aren't worth reading. And I don't say that to be critical or unkind. It's just kind of true. If you don't believe me, just go poke around. And adding more characters and more storylines isn't the way to make your story more interesting. It really isn't. And if that's the only trick you have up your sleeve, and that's the only idea that you have in order to make your story more interesting, and you find yourself falling back on that as a strategy to create drive and momentum in your narrative, it's a warning sign, and it means you don't yet have a handle on the fundamentals. That's okay. We all start wherever we start. Just understand that that's what's happening there. And instead of adding more bells and whistles, lean into the fundamentals. Go back and review your fundamentals. That's the way to do it. Now, the classical story structure, or arc plot, or the hero's journey, is not a beginner form of storytelling. It's not a basic form. Too often, I speak to writers who refuse to use this classical story structure because they have it in their minds that somehow it's childish or it's simplistic or that it won't offer enough twists and turns for the reader. But exactly the opposite is true. When you understand the arc plot story structure and you can execute it, your reader will be holding on by the seat of their pants. They really will. Happily, Whiplash is an arc plot story. It's a single protagonist, linear storyline, and it is brilliant. Now, when I'm studying the middle of a story, I personally tend to tend to break it into 2 parts. You can break it into 3 parts if you want. It still works the same. It's just a different way of approaching it. One isn't right or better than the other. It just depends on which one makes the most sense to you. Screenwriters, in my opinion, are way ahead of novelists when it comes to story structure. And most books about writing screenplays tend to break the middle into 2 parts. That's probably why I keep doing that. But the truth is that it's entirely possible to look at one story, or one movie in this case, and break the middle down into 2 parts and analyze it that way, or 3 parts and analyze it that way if it makes more sense for you. Both will work. Both can work. And I know that's a bit of a brain twister, but don't get too caught up with it. Just pick an approach that makes sense for you and go with it. Like I said, I start by breaking the middle into 2 parts. I analyze it that way unless it's not quite working or I can't, get a handle on it. And if I need to, then I switch to the 3-part approach. And, sometimes that makes it clearer. Okay, Melanie, before I start talking about Whiplash specifically, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
The only thing I'll add is the cast of characters in this movie is quite small. Like, I know there's an ensemble in the band, and there are some characters like Andrew's father, who's important in the story, but it really does just center around the antagonist and the protagonist. And I think if I can add anything, it is a really good example of how having 2 strong characters, main characters, can work extremely well. So that's the only thing that I'd add to what you've just said.
Okay, so how does Whiplash break down? Like I said, it's an arc plot story, which is a hero's journey. The beginning is about 15%. These are rough numbers, by the way. The beginning is about 15%. The middle is about 55%. And the ending is about 30%. So let's talk about the middle. Andrew crosses the threshold when he enters the rehearsal room for studio band. This is his extraordinary world, but it's the ordinary world for Fletcher, who's the antagonist. Remember, Act 2 takes place in the villain's world. And it's the villain who is constantly poking and prodding the hero to act. Whiplash is a beautiful example of this. And in fact, Melanie, you were just alluding to that. The power dynamic between these 2 characters is extraordinary. Fletcher, as the teacher and conductor of studio band, has all the power. Andrew, as a first-year student, has none. Poor Andrew, he is way out of his league here. I often get questions about whether the crossing the threshold stage is in Act 1 or Act 2 of a story. And the truth is that it's the barrier between the 2 stories. It's the threshold. And there are a number of thresholds in a story. So think about the threshold of your house. Is your front door inside of the house, or is it outside of the house? Or is it both? And does it matter? The same is true here. You can see the crossing the threshold stage as the end of Act 1 or the beginning of Act 2. Doesn't really matter. As long as it's clear that your character has crossed a threshold and they're now in an extraordinary world. Sometimes the extraordinary world is literally physically a new place. The character travels somewhere new. Other times it's a state of mind. In this case, Andrew's ordinary world is A band with the other first years. Now so that's the entry level band, right, for the new kids. And he suddenly jumped to studio band with the graduating senior best of the best students. That's an extraordinary world for Andrew. So Andrew begins Act 2 as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed student who is eager to please and who has big dreams. He finishes Act 2 completely disillusioned. He's given up music altogether and has stored his kit away. That is a huge internal shift. And it's only part of the character arc because, of course, there's a whole lot more happening in Act 3, which I won't talk about today. So let's stay focused on Act 2. So how does Damien Chazelle create this change in Andrew? This is where breaking Act 2 down into smaller pieces is really helpful because it allows us to track the change incrementally, because a change just doesn't, magically poof happen like that. Change happens in stages. So if we break the middle into two parts, we can see that each part can be further subdivided into two, giving us 4 parts. Now, this equates to the sequences that Melanie talked about last season. So for the sake of clarity, these would be sequences 3, 4, 5, and 6 of an 8-sequence structure. And if you want to know more about what I'm talking about, go listen to any of the episodes from last season. Melanie does a great job of explaining it all there. So the first part of Act 2 would be sequences 3 and 4, and the second part of Act 2 would be sequences 5 and 6. Hopefully that makes sense. It's hard to do with audio only. So hopefully you're following me here. All right, so let's look at the first part of Act 2, which are sequences 3 and 4. Sequence 3 is 15 minutes long, and Melanie talked about roughly having 15-minute sequences last season. This is Andrew's first rehearsal with studio band. And right out of the gate, Fletcher is physically and verbally abusive. He is awful. He's just awful. Now, the actor, J.K. Simmons, does an amazing job here. And yes, I try to stay away from commenting on things like acting and cinematography and so forth. But I have to say that everything in this film is working at a very high level. Yes, the writing is top-notch, but so is everything else. It would not surprise me at all to hear that this movie is being studied by film students, by lighting directors, by film editors. It is masterful. Okay, anyway, back to Andrew's first rehearsal. Act 2 contains a series of tests. So if you know your hero's journey, there's tests, allies, and enemies, right? This is a test. This rehearsal is a test. The protagonist will get the smallest test right out of the gate. So when he comes into the extraordinary world, he'll have his first test, and it will be the kind of the easiest to surmount. And then they get progressively more complicated and more intense as the story goes along. The protagonist will react to this test the way he would react to it if it had happened in his ordinary world. Because remember, he's still the same guy he was in the ordinary world. He hasn't changed yet. This is the start of his change. So when Fletcher attacks him, he cries. Now, you might ask yourself, why, oh why, would Andrew stay in studio band? Why would he stay in that situation? We wouldn't do it in our lives, but stories are not real lives. So as writers, what we have to do is take our protagonists and throw them in the deep end and make them get out themselves. We would never do that with anyone we loved in the real world. We'd be jumping in there and helping him. Even though we love our protagonists, we got to let them figure it out themselves. That's what great storytelling, that's where it comes from. All right. So why would Andrew stay in that awful situation? Andrew knows he's terrible, just like we, the viewer, know that he's terrible. And since this is the first test, Andrew and us, we all know it's only going to get worse from here. So why does he stay? Now, the answer is found in Andrew's object of desire. Part of what we have to do in Act 1, the beginning of the story, is establish the protagonist's object of desire. That is, what he wants. Now, personally, I like the phrase object of desire better than just calling it a want, because the phrase object of desire has a much greater intensity to it. I mean, I don't know about you, Melanie, but I want lots of things in life, but I don't have a burning desire for very many things. When something is an object of desire, we will move heaven and earth to get it. We'll happily sacrifice anything for it. This is what motivates your character to act. The object of desire is not some passing fancy. And this is a concept that a lot of writers struggle with because they've never experienced an object of desire in their own life. And if this is you, Melanie, or anybody listening, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Make your novel, the novel you're working on right now, make it your object of desire. Finish it. That's your goal. That's your object of desire. The thing you want more than anything in the world is to finish this book and go after it with everything you've got. Do whatever you have to do to finish it and get it published the way you want to get it published. That will start to give you a little bit of an insight into what an object of desire is. Nothing comes second to it. So Andrew's object of desire is to be one of the greatest drummers the world has ever seen. He wants to be right up there with Buddy Rich. That is no small target if you know jazz music at all. Now, Fletcher is the conductor of the best band in one of the best music schools in the country. Now, it's a fictional school, but, it's Juilliard, let's face it. Fletcher is the key to Andrew getting his object of desire. So why does Andrew stay and put up with Fletcher's abuse? Because Andrew wants to be the best drummer so badly, it's worth suffering Fletcher's behavior. Now, what does Fletcher want? Because the villain or the antagonist also has to have an object of desire, and he has to want it as badly as the protagonist wants his thing. Well, believe it or not, Fletcher's object of desire is to bring the best out of his students. He sees something in Andrew in that opening scene, and he wants to help Andrew reach his full potential. Now, this is what all teachers do, and that goal is laudable. We want our teachers to be like that. However, Fletcher's tactics are deplorable. The ends do not justify the means where Fletcher is concerned, not even for 5 seconds. Okay, so that's all in sequence 3. That's in 15 minutes, all that stuff. Now we look at sequence 4. Sequence 4 is primarily the Overbrook Jazz Competition, or this is the big thing that happens here. Andrew saves the day here by playing in the competition when Tanner can't, and because of it, he becomes the core drummer. But he makes enemies of all the other musicians in the band. We also see Andrew starting to emulate Fletcher. This is the beginning of a change now in Andrew's character, because in the last sequence, he behaved the way the ordinary world Andrew behaved. Now he's been through this horrible ordeal with Fletcher, and he's toughening up. But he's toughening up in a way that is emulating Fletcher's behavior. And he's treating his family very poorly. Kind of the way Fletcher talks to the other musicians in the band. Fletcher brings Conley in as the new drummer, but Conley's had the charts all day. Andrew is sight reading. So this is another test for Andrew, right? Remember the tests, allies, and enemies? Andrew's got to have a number of tests. This is another one. And what is it testing? It's not really, I was going to say it's not testing Andrew's fortitude, but it kind of is. What is being tested here is Andrew's object of desire. How badly does he want this thing? That's really what's being tested. If it's a passing fancy, your protagonist is going to tap out pretty quickly. But if it's truly a burning desire, your protagonist is going to dig in and get to work. And that's what Andrew does, right? Fletcher tells him, if you want this part of being the core drummer in studio band, earn it. And we see Andrew giving up everything to earn the core drummer part. He breaks up with Nicole. He practices until he bleeds. And we see an anger in Andrew that wasn't there before. Andrew in the beginning hook is so sweet, brings out the mama bear in me. That's what this movie does. Because when I first watched it, my son was that age and he was actually preparing to audition for music school. My daughter is now that age. So there are many times in this movie I wish I could go through the screen and stand between Fletcher and Andrew and protect Andrew. It's totally irrational. But that's the power of the storytelling here. It evokes such a strong emotion in me. So we also see then Andrew going head to head with both Tanner and Conley. All right. At the halfway mark of a story, and it is shockingly accurate at 50%. It might be 47%, it might be 52, 53%, but it's not 40% or 60%. It's right at halfway, the halfway mark of a story. something will happen to propel the story forward. It's like a shot of jet fuel that re-engages the reader or viewer and keeps them engaged right to the end. And this is another threshold of sorts, and it's called a midpoint shift. It has other names as well. Midpoint shift is the one I use. And again, I get the question about whether the midpoint shift is in the first part of Act 2 or the second part of Act 2. Doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's there. Part 1 of Act 2, that's sequences 3 and 4, they build to a crescendo or a climax, and that's the midpoint shift. And yes, the ramifications often do bleed into the second part of Act 2. And the climax here, this midpoint shift, it's bigger than the Act 1 climax, but it's not as big as the climax that comes in the second part of Act 2. And it's definitely not as big as the climax that comes in Act 3, because that's the climax of the whole story and the biggest of all. So you can kind of see things escalating, right? So the midpoint shift in Whiplash is the big drum off, I don't know what to call it, where Andrew goes head to head with Conley and Tanner to earn the part of the core drummer for studio band. Whew. Okay, nearly there. I'll move through the second part of Act 2 much faster. So this would be sequences 5 and 6. Sequence 5 is the Donnellan competition. Now, poor little Andrew, he's on the edge here, and he snaps. He has been physically and mentally abused by Fletcher since Act 2 began, and it has now broken him. It's crushed him. And this is, he even has a car accident trying to please Fletcher, and he plays on the stage bleeding. It's quite dramatic, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. And what happens? Fletcher kicks him out of the band. Well, what a jerk. Then we move into sequence 6. And here we find Andrew at his lowest point in the whole story. Andrew's out of shape, Schaefer. He has abandoned music entirely. And Fletcher's also gotten the heave-ho, by the way, because Andrew reports him. So there's another storyline happening here that I haven't mentioned yet, and it involves Sean Casey, who is a previous student of Fletcher's. And Sean has gone through exactly what Andrew has been going through, and he has committed suicide. So Andrew's dad, naturally enough, being very concerned for his son, has encouraged Andrew to report Fletcher and Fletcher's behavior, which he does. Fletcher gets the heave-ho. Andrew is completely lost and alone. So we've got this bright-eyed and bushy-tailed youth full of potential at the beginning of Act 2. And here we have him, if we look at these 4 big sequences, moving gradually from, the naive, young, still wet behind the ears Andrew to someone who is down and out. He's lonely and alone, and he wants nothing else to do with music anymore. It's a huge, huge shift. So when you take this big chunk of storytelling, at least 50% of your novel, and you break it down into these smaller chunks, and each of these chunks has a function, then you really start to see how you can move your story forward and keep it on track. And how you can move your story forward, not only in terms of the plot and what literally has to happen, but how you can reveal the characters. Because we are definitely seeing who Andrew is and who he's becoming and who Fletcher is. All right, I've been talking for a long time. That's enough for me. Melanie, what have you got for us this week?
Right. So now, before I dive into Whiplash, into the some of the meatier parts that Valerie's already touched on with Whiplash, I just want to say that, like Valerie said, this story is fantastic to study in terms of characterizations. The performances are amazing, and the story structure is really sound. By studying subtext, what I'm examining is the content and the message that the story is sending. So before I get to the message, Whiplash also has some good examples of how colour reinforces the atmosphere we associate with musicians Now, I know this is a visual storytelling format, but there are ways to translate that into written word. Now, some of it comes from resonance, which is what I'll study next season. But, when you say jazz music, it conjures up an image. And when you're writing, you can actually tap into some of those images and some of that atmosphere and put it into your text by word choice. But the way the movie does it is it uses colour. The movie occurs a great deal in the dark hours of the day, which taps into the nighttime lifestyle we expect musicians to have. The studio band practice in a traditional dark hardwood room, and Andrew's flat is dark and run down. The room where Andrew practices have dark greens and burnt oranges. So the dark greens are at the Sheffer practice rooms, and the orange is a bit run down, and I believe it's in Andrew's flat. And Andrew also packs up his drum in his home, so in the orange room, after he gets kicked out of Fletcher's studio band. And this room probably reflects Andrew's state of mind at that point in the movie. Then we see Andrew unpack his drums again, and this is a really interesting shift because this time when he unpacks it, the room is alight and there's a lot of daylight, there's a lot of white colours, and it actually represents, I suppose, a rebirth at one end, but definitely he's getting something back in his life that brings him light. So that change symbolises a change in his thinking and potentially a change in his view of playing the drums. So by comparison to the other rooms, it's almost ethereal. And now, if I just want to touch quickly on Andrew's relationship with Nicole, because this also provides us with a lot of information about him. So the 2 times Andrew asks Nicole out follow directly the 2 times he's been given praise or attention from Fletcher. Andrew also dumps Nicole in a very brutal way, telling her that she would only get in the way of his greatness. Now, what do we infer from Andrew's interactions with Nicole? Well, there's a part of that is socially awkward. So Andrew comes across as a socially awkward person. And he also, like Valerie mentioned, transitions from a sweet, innocent boy into someone who becomes quite ruthless and very harsh. So he's channeling, when he breaks up with Nicole, some of those Fletch characteristics. And I was thinking during the week that maybe he also went to the Tom Brady relationship school and got some advice there. Because, who wants anyone to get in the way of their greatness? Anyway, on a more serious note, does Andrew's relationship with Nicole tell us that he was right not to get involved with her, that personal lives get in the way, and that only the unbalanced life makes way for success? So these are all good questions which the movie raises through the subtext and through suggestion. And there's something to ponder as you're watching the movie if you haven't already watched it. Now, before I go on, I just want to point something out. So I have a very traumatic visceral response to this movie because of the military style abuse in it. Now, Valerie and I obviously have very different reactions to some of the content and the meaning of the story, and that's okay. And this is the value I think that we both bring to the podcast and also to each other in our offline conversations when we nerd out on story together. So my response to this, and Valerie touched on this before, is my response to this movie is born from certain experiences that I've had. And this isn't the responsibility of the writer, nor is it a problem if anyone else doesn't have the same reaction or feel the same way. And I really do believe that this is the beauty of storytelling. Our cultural differences and our life experiences all shape the way we react to a story. And so there's no right or wrong in any of that reaction and what we take away from a story. So after watching this movie a few times now, I can explain how and why I respond the way that I do. Now, at the end of last week's episode, I said I would discuss how to identify subtext. And this week, I'll look at some of the examples of how Whiplash uses subtext to create the protagonist and antagonist and how I identify it. I'll also put the actions of the two primary characters together and hopefully offer a summary of what I think the movie is really telling us. In the book Writing Subtext, What Lies Beneath by Dr. Linda Seeger, she says, and I quote, "Usually the subtext is something you can't quite put your finger on. It is felt, you sense it, it niggles us, tells us something isn't right, or I don't believe a word that they say," and that's on page 3. She also says, when you are confused about a movie, you are probably experiencing subtext, and that's on page 5. Based on Seeger's advice, you can identify subtext by paying attention to what you're feeling. For example, in the opening of the movie, when we first see Andrew playing and Fletch listening, we feel something is off about the interaction between the two. This short scene of 3 minutes packs a powerful punch and sets the movie up for the type of person that Fletcher is. So how does the director do this? Well, we only see Fletcher's head when we first meet him. The rest of his body is shrouded in darkness. He's also dressed in black. He comes into the light when he starts ordering Andrew to play. So also, how does J.K. Simmons do this? Well, it's in his words. So he calls Andrew a wind-up monkey. And it's also in Fletcher's tone with phrases like, "Do you know who I am?" And in his actions. So he demands Andrew plays. Andrew plays, he cuts him off. There's a new demand. Andrew plays, he cuts him off. Then we hear the door slam. And Fletch walks out on Andrew as he's playing. But he does come back to get his jacket. So this is a great and important example in characterization, or how to build characters and how to set up and present a character in a way that gets people's spidey senses tingling. So in the first 3 minutes, we know Fletch is not going to be a supportive but firm mentor like Sean is in Good Will Hunting. And by the end of the movie, we have no doubt that Fletcher is a psychopath. Well, maybe other people do, but I don't. And we feel this from the moment that we meet him. And it's confirmed over and over again in the story. So we're never told that Fletch is a psychopath. It all comes out in the subtext. And it's a combination of his actions and his words. But I was really fascinated by this, so especially in terms of the subtext developing the character. So I went very quickly and searched up some characteristics of psychopaths, and these are the 10 that I found. And just think about Fletch and think about the things that he does through the movie when I'm reading this list out. So the first one is manipulation. So they're a manipulative person. They have impulsiveness. They lack empathy. They're dishonest. They have a proclivity for violence. They act in a superficial way. They're highly intelligent, arrogant, have a faulty moral compass, and lack culpability. Now, throughout the movie, Fletcher exhibits every single one of these characteristics. And in the first meeting, though, the one that I've just talked about, I believe we see 5 signs out of the 10. So there's a level of manipulation that we see. We see some impulsiveness. We see the lack of empathy. We see his high intelligence and his arrogance. But at the same time, we're meeting Andrew, who, on the other hand, is practicing the drums because he wants to be a professional drummer. Andrew is very apologetic and very compliant. Andrew is very much like his father, and his father is the type of person who apologizes when someone else hits him in the head with their popcorn bucket when he's at the movies. And as Valerie mentioned, we see a huge change in Andrew's character by the end of the movie. And this is where the message of the movie, delivered in the subtext, became problematic for me. Andrew is shaped into the mould of Fletcher. And in my view, the ending is even more frightening because Andrew is actually endorsing Fletcher's view that I was there to push people beyond what's expected of them. And we see this in the collaborative smile that they give each other right at the end of the movie. Now, I said at the top of the episode that I don't believe this movie is about music and how to become a great musician. I do think it's more about abuse and power. And so, where is the evidence and how do I know this? Well, think about the following scenes. So, I've just mentioned the meeting Fletch scene, which we've already been through. And then think about how Fletch asks Andrew about his family and then uses this information to humiliate him in front of the band, as well as throw chairs at him. And then Andrew thinks that he has earned the position of first drummer and then Fletch brings Connolly into the room and the brutal drum off occurs amongst verbal insults about race, sexuality, parentage, and constant cutting of playing to meet almost impossible standards. And that in the movie goes for 5 hours, not in movie time, but that's the time that that scene occurs over if you watch the clock. So there is a pattern to Fletcher's behaviour, and this is important because it makes us nervous when Fletch is nice. So the pattern should heighten our anxiety when Andrew runs into Fletch in the bar and when Fletch asks him to pay for his JVC band. So that's right at that point that Valerie didn't talk about. So that's in their ending payoff and the final sequences of the movie. So if we go back to that scene at the bar, Fletch says to Andrew, I don't think people understand what it was that I was doing at Schaefer. I was there to push people beyond what's expected of them. I believe it was an absolute necessity. And then Andrew asks, is there a line? Do you go too far? Fletch responds by saying, the next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged. So in my view, the answer to the question of how far is too far, or more specifically, is it all right to use abuse as a method to train people? The answer is no. The answer is just no. But this movie is an excellent case study that forces us to think about this question on a deeper level. There is a flippant and easy way to think about Andrew and ask, would he have achieved his level of success without his experiences with Fletch? I don't think that's the case. I think Andrew would have reached his potential without his treatment by Fletch. He always had it in him. Fletch didn't give Andrew his musical gift or his chutzpah. It's always Andrew's to bring to the forefront. So there's also the question about talent versus hard work. Now, there's a great poster on the wall of my son's gym that says, hard work will beat talent if talent doesn't work hard. And I think that this is one of life's truisms. Andrew works hard. Is he blessed with more talent than any of the other talented people at the Schaefer Conservatory? Well, I'm not sure because we don't necessarily see that on screen. But what we do see is his work ethic. He will do more than others, and he even, as Valerie mentioned, put his own life at risk. So there's something else that's really important to note around the story of the symbol that's thrown at Charlie Parker, who's called Bird. So in the movie, Fletch tells Andrew about how Joe Jones threw a symbol at Bird's head, and Bird was so humiliated that he practiced and practiced for over a year, and when he came back, those who had laughed at him were blown away by his skills and brilliance. So this story is used to justify Fletcher's behaviour and put Andrew in a place where he must accept humiliation and physical violence in order to be great. So technically, it's a fantastic use of subtext. The problem is the real story about the symbol and Bird is actually very different. So Gene Rambley, who was present during the symbol incident, recounted in the book Kansas City Lightning, which is a biography about Parker. He said that Parker was playing the drum solo and had somehow got his timing all wrong and he couldn't get out of the solo that he was playing. And after someone tried twice to ring a bell and break him out of his playing trance, he just kept going. Then Joe Jones picked up a cymbal and dropped it on the ground and yelled ding, which caused Parker to stop. So he was laughed at and he was humiliated. But it wasn't done with the intent to injure or oppress him. And then 12 months later, Bird, after jamming regularly with the band, with other bands and studying harmonies on the piano, as well as listening to trumpet and saxophone players, came back and blew people away. I think Parker's story feels far more authentic as a musical performance story when I compare it to Andrew's. But Bird's story is an excellent example of how to use the message of another story to convey the theme that you're trying to address in your own story. I would just say, though, sometimes be aware of changing a true story too much, because people who are pedantic, like me, will go and check things out. So I go back to the quote from Lisa Cron's book, Wired for Story, that we've used in several episodes before to emphasize why it's important to understand what your story is really about. And she says, we're wired to turn to story to teach us the ways of the world. So what are we meant to think at the end of Whiplash? What is the way of the world according to Whiplash? Well, in the end, Fletcher's behaviour is justified, and the abuse Andrew took made him a good drummer. And I think that's not so great. Seriously, it's one thing to work hard and to excel, but it's another thing to accept the ravings of a psychotic music professor. And this is all in the subtext of this movie. It's what's implied, although never stated. And that is the feeling and the message that we're left with at the end. So, Valerie, what do you think? Or do you want to just go straight to action steps?
Well, what you're doing is underlining what a great example this film is of character development. I mean, we could have just talked about that for 4 hours. So,
Yeah.
I'm talking about how that middle of the story is developed, and I touched on how it's revealing Andrew's character. And you're talking about subtext, but it's also underlining the development of Andrew's character and the development of Fletcher's character. And I was nodding my head as you were doing several of your bits there. And, for example, in the ending payoff, which I didn't talk about today because it's outside the scope, that's when the antagonist, Fletcher, has his big monologue, right? There's always a monologue. The villain always gets a monologue. It's a fun game to watch for it. One of the things when we're writing a story, and we have to develop our antagonist just as much as we do our protagonist, and a key point about the antagonist is that he or she has to have a point. And this point makes the audience go, he's right. I don't like to say he's right, but he's right. So when Fletcher is in the bar and he's talking to Andrew, this is great narrative drive, right? Total dramatic irony, because we're frightened to death for Andrew because we know Fletcher's being nice. This is not going to be something bad's cooking here.
Going to happen, yep.
Yeah, exactly. And he's talking about why he pushes his students so far. And he talks about the Starbucks jazz CDs. Now, if you're into jazz, or I studied jazz for a while, if you're into jazz or if you're into music at all, and you really love the greats like Charlie Parker and Buddy Rich and Miles Davis and so forth, and then you listen to the Starbucks jazz CD, you know exactly what Fletcher is talking about. And if we extrapolate it beyond the world of music, it's true in any field. We're going to lose our audience if we don't clue it up soon. So let me get on to today's action step. What I want you to do is look closely at your protagonist's objects of desire and determine whether it's strong enough to keep your protagonist motivated throughout the middle build or the second act of your story. Is your character, does he want whatever he wants so badly that he would be willing, like Andrew, to put up with something as dire as behavior like Fletcher's?
Right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Storm Boy. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and help us spread the word by telling your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or find me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.